More DEI infighting on X? Billionaire Mark Cuban and author Christopher Rufo got into it on the social media platform. Last week, Cuban sat down with podcaster Lex Fridman, and they found themselves in a debate on DEI and wokeism. Jordan Peterson blasted Cuban's comments in the interview, writing on X, "This is exactly how elite liberals think. DEI, they don't really mean equity, they mean equality of outcome."
In response, Cuban said, "I was with a group of people who were proponents of DEI. They asked me what I would do to reduce the resistance to DEI. I told them to do a search and replace in all of their materials for equality of outcomes to equality of opportunities." He also quoted Rufo in one of his responses to Peterson, writing, "The great weakness of the cultural revolution is that it negates the metaphysics, morality, and stability of the common citizen. As it undermines the institutions of family, faith, and community, it creates a void in the human heart that cannot be."
Rufo then chimed in, "Appreciate you quoting my book. We should have a long-form discussion and debate about DEI. You can choose the platform." The two then went back and forth on X that whole afternoon on what the correct definition of DEI is, as well as the quote-unquote correct distribution of power in the government. In one of the exchanges, Rufo said, "My greatest concern is that we are creating a fourth branch of government with enormous power over the American people. DEI in practice is a method for the bureaucracy to reshape culture, law, and policy without the consent of the governed." To which Cuban replied, "On the DEI front, isn't it a contradiction to say that the government bureaucracy is absolutely awful at everything but implementing DEI and left-wing policies?"
Yeah, I mean, there are some contradictions there. So, for one, this is a bizarre thing that we're having this conversation happening between one of the richest men on the planet and someone who has very openly made his career about stigmatizing certain words. First, it was CRT, and now it's DEI. I'm not saying that that's not a kind of a bad faith attack at Christopher Rufo. He has very openly said, my goal is to get people to associate various cultural phenomena that they don't like with CRT, and then later he moved on to DEI. So the fact that they're debating the definition of it is kind of beside the point. Christopher Rufo's project is to say, to the extent that people have various grievances that can range from not liking it when they see a black pilot when they get on their plane, to feeling like they're not getting professional opportunities because someone undeserving has taken that spot, you can lump all of that into one pot, and you can call it CRT, you can call it DEI, but it really is an argument that white men in particular are getting an unfair shake in society because of programs that are equality programs. So I think the argument that needs to be had is, one, whether or not there are some legitimate flaws in equality programs. I would argue that there are, not just for the reasons that Rufo is, but because I think a pamphlet that tells you that, timeliness is white supremacy isn't actually helping to make the world more fair or just or equal for anybody. But also because I think a lot of it is a shell game, because Mark Cuban's sitting there talking about DEI and that he's a proponent of it. I mean, that's fine. He owns a company. He can do what he wants to do. But what we're not having a conversation about is the fact that apparently black startups have 0.5% of all venture capital funding. 1.6% of the Fortune 500 companies have black leadership. There are incredible asymmetries that exist that nobody is talking about because at the end of the day, there is an overemphasis on what some HR training pamphlet says, as opposed to addressing why systemic inequalities have not been addressed because from our apartheid system that ended just when my parents were children.
Well, it's an interesting point that you raised because it does seem like a lot of these DEI policies, when you get down to a sort of quota, for example, or a targeting of an industry that maybe doesn't have equal representation in terms of ratios of populations of different minority groups, it doesn't always ask why that is. And so you can't really address a disparity if you don't acknowledge why it exists in the first place. And I'm sure we would probably debate over in different industries why some of that disparity exists. But it does seem like, in general, these policies really miss the point. And just like with a lot of the so-called cultural sensitivity trainings that were implemented in major corporations or on university campuses, after research was done into it, it turned out that it actually had the opposite effect of actually creating more of what they call unconscious bias, or more stigmas against minority groups, or increase the prevalence of stereotypes in workplaces and on campus, because all it did was enshrine this sort of negative thinking by forcing people to go through trainings that they might have had more unconscious, and bringing it to the surface after they do like a conscious bias training.
I don't know about that. I mean, I think when we're having these conversations, I'm often one of the only ones in the room who has worked in corporate America. I was an attorney for 7 years in big law. I experienced that side of the HR trainings. And while I don't think that they were especially beneficial, I'm not going to say that there wasn't a need in those environments to protect more junior employees from very explicitly, frankly, bigoted statements and beliefs that were held by, let's say, partners at the law firm. So there's silly, petty stuff like, yes, I would prefer if a partner were told that they shouldn't say that my hair would look like a clown hair, for example, which is a real thing that happened. But that's not really what's hurting me in terms of my professional advancement. The bigger problems were what happens when partners aren't willing to take junior female attorneys out for later in the evening dinners or drinks the way they do male associates because of what the optics of taking a young woman out look like. And am I missing out on job opportunities because the way that juniors are developed in these contexts is often gendered in different ways. So, are women getting fewer opportunities for face time with partners because partners are used to doing certain kind of activities with junior associates who 40 years ago would have been predominantly male? And I don't think that those DEI programs are really getting at the root of those kinds of problems. They're not getting at the root of what it means for there to be an education system, for instance, that was literally segregated when my parents were kids. All of my aunts and uncles on my dad's side went to segregated schools. This is an ancient history. What do you do about the asymmetry in that educational background? And also to the fact that despite Brown v. Board and these immigration orders and busting on all of the controversy around that, most black kids don't go to school with white people, and we still live in a very segregated public school system that has implications for the quality of education people get because it's also segregated on economic lines. We have almost no room for that conversation at the same time that we're expected to invest all of our political energy and whether or not a mediocre student doesn't get into a Texas state school, or whether some billionaire's kid doesn't manage to get into Harvard no matter how much their parents donated. Is that really sidestepping kind of the bigger kind of class issues that also negatively implicate poor white Americans who also are being kept from these opportunities because of economic disenfranchisement?
Yeah, and that's the sticking point for me, which is I don't know if you saw Coleman Hughes' appearance on The View recently, but
I didn't watch it, but I saw of it, but I haven't.
Yeah, I mean, but his point, and the point that he makes in his book, was that if you're going to have programs that disproportionately target for opportunities people from disenfranchised groups, if you decide to not do it based on race and instead do it on socioeconomic status, you end up disproportionately targeting Hispanics and blacks anyway because they are disproportionately poor. So it's a way to basically have a DEI program in the least controversial definition of the term, while not making it about skin color.
Yeah, I like that, but here's the caveat, and I really encourage people to read the most recent Nicole Hannah-Jones piece in the New York Times. What she gets at is when you look at the historical trajectory of how affirmative action programs have been litigated in the courts, literally like 10 years after slavery, you start to get these arguments that you should not be discriminating against white people because of their color, even when I think most of us could appreciate now that maybe you should have a Freedmen's Bureau, some of these other policies to try to help people who lived for hundreds of years under chattel slavery be able to live their lives. But almost immediately they started to use this argument that somehow helping this clearly disenfranchised population was at the expense of some other white people. And because of that narrative in jurisprudence, what ended up happening was that the original affirmative action wasn't supposed to be about skin color. That was an a kind of a narrative shift instigated by conservatives. Initially, it was supposed to be about redress, saying this population of Black Americans had specific historical harms done to them by the federal government that deserve redress in the same way that reparations for the Japanese interned or Holocaust survivors is deserved. And because of the shift that happened in the courts, where Brown was decided on the basis of the skin color and the negative socialization and internalized racism of Black kids, as opposed to keeping it focused on racial redress for an actual harm, that's how we've gotten to this slippery place where it feels like the policy isn't actually getting to the bottom of it. So I agree with you, except that I would say I don't think it's just economics. Nicole Hannah-Jones makes a point that there are still different historical lineages that a white poor person and a Black poor person who was a descendant of slavery and the recent apartheid experienced in the United States of America, the policy should be working toward addressing those specific harms.
Yeah, I know we have to wrap, but if I just may respond really quickly to the shift in the way that affirmative action was talked about is also due to the racial classification system in America, where you ended up having a situation with colleges, and this was part of what brought Students for Fair Admissions, which was a discrimination against Asian Americans, not white Americans, at Harvard and other schools. But the racial classification system made it so that these affirmative action policies at campuses, at the university level, allowed the descendant of a Kenyan billionaire to achieve the same status as someone who might have been
Nicole makes
a descendant
that exact
of
point,
slavery.
that most Black people at Ivy League schools are not in fact descendants of slaves. I remember counting at one point in my class that I was one of 10, and that included like a bunch of biracial students as well. 10 descendants of Black American slavery in a class where we had about 160 Black people total. So, all right, this is fascinating. Thank you for engaging with me on this, Amber. Stick around. We have more Rising for you coming up next.